Your school got its name from the ancient Greek word for leisure, not a school subject, not a building. The actual word, scholē, meant free time, rest from work, the condition of having nothing else you had to do. Somewhere between then and now, the word describing the absence of obligation became the word for one of the most obligatory institutions in modern life. And that reversal is the small end of a much bigger one. Here's where this actually starts, and it's further back than Greece. In 1966, an anthropologist named Marshall Sahlins stood up at a symposium in Chicago called Man the Hunter and said something that directly contradicted what almost everyone in the room believed. The standard picture of prehistoric hunter-gatherers, going back to writers like the archaeologist Robert Braidwood in the 1950s, was grim. A person spending their whole life chasing animals just to eat, moving from one berry patch to the next, effectively living like an animal themselves. Constant grinding labor, from waking to sleeping, just to survive long enough to do it again the next day. Sahlins looked at the actual ethnographic data being gathered on real, living hunter-gatherer societies, groups in the Kalahari Desert, in Arnhem Land in northern Australia, and argued something close to the opposite. Based heavily on the fieldwork of researchers like Richard Lee among the Akung San, Sahlins calculated that these societies worked somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week to meet their material needs, with plenty of time left over for rest, socializing, and storytelling. He called them the original affluent society. Not affluent in the sense of having a lot of possessions. Affluent because they wanted little and got what they wanted easily, without needing to accumulate anything beyond it. Hunters, he wrote, kept bankers' hours. You'd assume that settled the question. It didn't. It just moved the argument to a different set of scholars, working with better instruments and far more sites than Sahlins ever had access to in the 1960s. Here's where it gets interesting, though, because centuries after any of this anthropological data existed, long before anyone was measuring foraging hours with modern statistical methods, a civilization built an entire philosophy around the idea that leisure, not labor, was the highest human condition a person could achieve. And they built the word for it directly into their language, in a way that's still sitting inside English right now, mostly unnoticed by the people using it every day. Here's the honest complication, and it's a real, live one. Sahlins' numbers have been challenged hard by later anthropologists working with more complete data than was available in the 1960s. A 2019 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences looked across dozens of forager and small-scale farming societies and found average work hours closer to 40 to 45 hours a week, not so different from a modern full-time job with a standard work week. Part of the issue is what actually counted as work in the original calculation. Some of Sahlins' source figures only measured time spent directly hunting or gathering food itself, leaving out the processing of that food afterward, cooking it, making and repairing tools, childcare, and all the labor that surrounds getting food without technically being the hunting or the gathering. When later researchers went back and counted everything involved in keeping a household fed and functioning, not just the moment of the hunt, the numbers climbed substantially. As one modern anthropologist reviewing the 50-year legacy of the idea put it bluntly, the data behind original affluence and the enormous interpretive weight people have hung on that data are, frankly, difficult to reconcile with each other. So which is it? Nobody can currently give you a clean, single answer, and that's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. What most researchers now seem to agree on is something in between the extremes. Hunter-gatherer life wasn't the desperate, ceaseless grind Braidwood imagined, but it also probably wasn't the 15-hour idle Sahlins first proposed either. The truth seems to depend heavily on which society, which environment, which season you're looking at. In classical Athens, skholē meant leisure specifically in the sense of freedom from necessary obligatory work. Not laziness or idleness, but the open, unstructured time in which a person could actually think without being interrupted by the demands of survival. The word for ordinary labor, scholē, literally meant not leisure. Work was defined grammatically as the absence of the good thing rather than the good thing itself getting its own independent name. That's backwards from how most modern languages handle it, where leisure is the word built as an exception to the default of work. Aristotle used scholē specifically to describe the kind of open-ended discussion held in his own school, the Lyceum. Conversation that had no economic purpose behind it, no practical output required, nothing driving it except available time and genuine curiosity. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argued that a life spent purely on practical necessity, however well managed, could never reach real human flourishing, eudaimonia, because that required the kind of sustained contemplative activity that only leisure made possible. He went further, warning that a state whose citizens never achieved real skholē, a population permanently busy, always occupied, never at rest, was, in his view, a state quietly heading toward its own collapse from exhaustion and misdirected activity. You're not looking at a culture that saw leisure as a reward for hard work. You're looking at a culture that saw hard work as the obstacle standing between people and the actual point of being alive. Rome took the same idea and split it in half, linguistically, in an even more direct way. The Latin word otium meant leisure, in more or less the same elevated sense as the Greek concept it borrowed from. But the Roman word for regular business, commerce, and labor was negotium, literally negotium, not leisure, built the exact same backwards way as the Greek scholē. That word is still sitting inside modern English right now, almost entirely unnoticed by the people using it. Negotiate, negotiation. Every time a modern business deal gets negotiated, the word doing the work was built, more than 2,000 years ago, specifically to mean the opposite of rest. The thing you do when you are, definitionally, not at leisure. Here's the honest complication for this half of the story, too, and it matters at least as much as the anthropological one. This entire philosophy of leisure was only ever available to a small slice of the population that held it up as the highest human good. Aristotle taught in his scholē, and the people who had the time to attend and participate were, by and large, wealthy free men, supported by an economy that ran heavily on enslaved labor and on the excluded, unpaid work of women running households, neither of whom had any skholē of their own to speak of. The leisure is the point of a good life. Philosophy wasn't some universal ancient value shared equally across Greek society. It was a value built, quite directly and quite literally, on other people's unfree labor, making that leisure possible for a relatively small group in the first place. That's not a footnote tacked onto the end of the story. It's part of what the story actually is, and leaving it out would make the whole thing sound a lot more idyllic than it was. So here's the shape of the whole thing, laid end to end, 3 civilizations deep. A prehistoric society that, by at least one influential and still genuinely contested account, may have worked far less than modern assumptions give it credit for. An account that newer data has substantially complicated without fully overturning it. A classical civilization that built an entire philosophical vocabulary around the idea that freedom from work, not work itself, was the actual point of a well-lived human life, while quietly depending on enslaved and excluded labor to make that freedom possible for the relative few who got to enjoy it. And a Latin-speaking empire that split the same underlying idea into 2 words, leisure and not leisure, one of which we now use dozens of times a day to describe the exact opposite of what it originally meant. And somewhere in the centuries after all of that, the word for the good part, the leisure part, got attached, almost accidentally, to the institution most modern people associate with early mornings, deadlines, testing, and obligation. By the time the word finally reached English as school, passing through Latin scholē along the way, the leisure meaning had almost entirely drained out of it, replaced by something closer to its opposite. Aristotle, looking at a modern classroom full of students working toward exams on a fixed schedule, probably wouldn't recognize a single thing about it except the name on the building. And even that, he'd likely find genuinely strange, since the word over the door now describes something close to the opposite of what it was originally coined to mean. If stories like this, the ones where a single word turns out to be carrying 2,000 years of an argument nobody ever actually resolved, are the kind of thing you're into, subscribe. There's a new one every few days. Somewhere, right now, there's a student sitting in a building whose name literally means free time, working through an assignment with absolutely no idea that the word over the door was once the highest thing a person could hope to have.